This is the Content Marketing Podcast, episode number 96, Storytelling 101, I Need a Hero. Hello and welcome to the Content Marketing Podcast. This is the show where we help you attract and retain business through the power of quality content. I'm your host, Rachel Parker of Resonance Content Marketing, and today is November 13th, 2014. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for episode number 96 of the Content Marketing Podcast. Man, we are barreling toward the big century mark, our 100th episode. I think that's going to be coming up in early December, and we are definitely going to be planning something special, including a giveaway, so stay tuned. Just a reminder, we are live on iTunes and on Stitcher, so if you're listening to this episode on the blog, you can click on over and subscribe. It means you'll get new episodes automatically delivered to your listening device of choice. And if you use a different app for your podcast listening pleasure, we also have an RSS feed, and I will provide that link in the blog post. This month is all about storytelling here at Resonance, and in our last podcast, we addressed the question, why storytelling and why now? If you happen to miss that episode, feel free to click on over to iTunes or to Stitcher or to the RSS feed and get all caught up. So that brings me to today's topic. Today we are talking about one thing that every story needs, and that is a hero. But first, it's time to check in with our news feed for this week's rundown of news you can use. First up in today's news feed is an item out of Twitter. Twitter has introduced a new app called the Small Business Planner. And the goal of this app is to help small businesses get ready for the busy holiday season. And it's downloadable on it's available on the iTunes App Store and on Google Play. So for both Apple and Android devices. And it lets you do a number of different things. Number one, you can browse a daily calendar themed around four main topics. So it will offer you tweet suggestions, Twitter ad strategies, information on Twitter tools, exclusive events, things like that. And it also lets you add the most relevant topics to your own agenda. So you can create your own marketing calendar as you get ready to enter the holiday season, and that will sync with your personal device calendar. So now you can keep track of Twitter alongside all of your other regular on and offline marketing activities, and offers some other capabilities as well. I admit I have downloaded it. I've played with it a little bit. It looks really cool, so I highly recommend that you check it out. Again, it is free, and it is available for download on the iTunes App Store and also on Google Play. Next up is a really exciting outcome, or an exciting item, to me at least, because I am a big fan of both of the companies involved. SlideShare has announced that it is incorporating Haiku Deck into the SlideShare website. So previously, when you use SlideShare, and again, SlideShare is one of my secret weapons. It just gets a crazy amount of traffic. It lets you create visual and share visual content. It's just a little gem. So it's one of my favorite apps out there for creating and sharing content. But previously, when you use SlideShare, you would have to create your own PowerPoint presentation or your own PDF or whatever it was and upload it. But what this partnership with Haiku Deck does, and Haiku Deck is another one of my favorite players in the online content world, Haiku Deck is now actually integrated into the SlideShare platform. So when you go to SlideShare, you have your regular upload button that lets you upload your PowerPoint or whatever it is you have, but you can also create a Haiku Deck deck right there within SlideShare. So you don't need to create something offline and then upload it. You can actually create it right then and there. And it incorporates all the capabilities of Haiku Deck. If you've not used Haiku Deck, it is fantastic. It's a great app to use for presentations. One feature is that they automatically limit the number of words that can appear on one slide, which a lot of us deal with, the bloated slide syndrome. And it's really just visually very visually appealing. So I highly recommend that you check that out. If you go to SlideShare and you have an account at SlideShare, then you will be able to use this capability of creating your own haiku deck right there on the website. Okay, for this week's content hit of the week, I have chosen a post called 10 Tactics to Increase Newsletter Subscriptions. And this is by Alexander, and I hope I pronounce this name right. Alexander Ciz, CZYZ, on the Marketing Profs blog. And the reason that this appealed to me is that, email is kind of that tried and true workhorse that, there are other shiny objects that seem to be cooler and sexier, but email is just kind of that old reliable standby. But it really is one of our most powerful tools in terms of engaging our audience. In fact, we devoted a whole month to e-newsletters last month. It was all about creating and optimizing your e-newsletter. So, and even more so as organic reach is dropping on all these social networks. I don't know if you looked at your Facebook organic reach lately, but I know mine is pretty depressing, and I'm sure yours is too. It's getting harder and harder to be heard and to be seen on these social networks, whereas email is the same as it's always been. So all the more reason to make more investment in terms of time and resources into email. Anyway, in this post, Alexander, Mr. Ciz, if I'm pronouncing that right, shares 10 ways to drive those signups and to grow that list. And even if you're kind of an e-newsletter guru, it's a good reminder of some things that, some tactics that you might have forgotten about in terms of driving signups to your e-newsletter. And I want to reiterate that one of the great things about your e-newsletter is that your list belongs to you. Okay, Facebook can do whatever they want, LinkedIn can do whatever they want, but your email list is your property, period, end of story. And that is it's just an absolute gold mine and something to be very carefully curated and very carefully grown. It's not something you want to let stagnate. So I highly recommend you check out Alexander's blog on the Marketing Profs site, and I will share that link in the blog post to this episode. Okay, that's it for this week's update. If you stumble across something you think might be of interest to your fellow content marketers, please shoot it on over to us so we can share. Now it's time for this week's Spotlight segment. As I mentioned, November is all about storytelling here at Resonance. It's become a huge buzzword in the marketing world, so we are dedicating this month to really helping you make sense of storytelling and to show you how to leverage it for your own content marketing program. And last week we talked about why storytelling and why now. And today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive by talking about the one thing that every story absolutely has to have, and that is a hero. You know I couldn't resist, right? Child of the 80s that I am, I just had to haul out a little Bonnie Tyler to kick off this segment. But seriously, I do want to talk about one thing that every story needs, and that is a hero. One reason that stories are so powerful is that they evoke emotion. And emotions can only come from a personal connection. If you think about it, no one has ever sat on the edge of his or her seat rooting for an idea or rooting for a movement or rooting for data. We root for people. And so at the center of your story has got to be a person that people can root for. Now, notice I said person, I didn't necessarily say human being, because anyone who has ever watched a Disney film or a Pixar movie knows that the hero does not have to be a human being. I mean, think about Toy Story. Think about WALL-E. Think about the Disney classics like Bambi and Dumbo. These did not have human heroes, but they were entities with human characteristics, and because they were so human in their characteristics, in the way they talked, their emotions, they were instantly relatable. And that's what makes the core of a good story. That's what makes a good hero. Even going back to those basic stories that we heard as kids, if you remember The Little Engine That Could, okay, that hero was a little train engine. But this train engine was facing an impossible task, trying to haul this train up this big hill. And that is a situation that everyone can relate to. So you really have to give your audience a hero. You need to give them someone to root for. So when you go to tell that story, you've got to think about all the people who are involved and think about, okay, who is this story going to revolve around? Who are people going to relate to and cheer for and follow all the way to the end? So I want to talk about some of the characteristics of a hero. Really, there are two that we as marketers need to be concerned with. Number one, the hero has to be relatable. People have to care about this hero of your story. You can't just introduce this person and take them and expect people to instantly latch onto them as you take them through this story. You need to make them relatable. So when I talk about one of my favorite content marketing success stories to share when I do presentations is I talk about Blendtec. And I don't talk about Blendtec as a company. I talk about their VP of marketing, who was a guy named George Wright. And I talk about how he was, brought in to help them increase sales and it just wasn't doing very well and he was very frustrated. And then along came this idea that had to do with a little channel called YouTube. And then the story goes on from there. But the hero's got to be relatable. You don't want to create a hero that is just larger than life and no one could possibly have anything in common with. You don't want your hero to be a Superman. Or if you do, you want to definitely show that Clark Kent side of him very clearly so that the audience can say, wow, I can relate to that person. I've been up against the same thing. I've felt that exact same way. And then take your hero into the story. Speaking of story, that comes to the second characteristic of a hero, and that is that the hero has to experience conflict. There's an expression in dramatic writing, and especially in screenplay writing. There's a simple formula. You create a hero that you really, really love, and then you send him up a tree and throw rocks at him. And that's what we do, because without conflict, there is no story. Imagine telling a story and saying, okay, there was this guy named Steve Jobs, and he was really smart, and he found this guy named Steve Wozniak, and together they created this company called Apple, and it became one of the biggest brands of all time. The end. Everybody made a lot of money and lived happily ever after. There's no conflict in that. It's not really a story. There's nothing to keep us on the edge of our seats. Nothing to leave us wondering what happens next. So that conflict is kind of the hinge of the story. So you introduce your hero and you get your audience involved, get them to relate to this person, get them to like and trust this person and to be rooting for them, and then you introduce the conflict. So the hero has to want something, and then there has to be something in his or her way that has to be overcome. Speaking of conflict, got a little puppy conflict going on in the background. My apologies. And if you think about the different types of conflict, now this is going to take you back probably to your 8th or 9th grade English class. You might remember covering the types of conflict like person versus society, person versus self, person versus person. So, think about the conflict that your hero comes across in the quest to pursue his or her goal. And really, don't gloss over that conflict. Really make it gritty and real and relatable and personal and emotional. What comes up in the hero when they come up against that conflict? Do they get angry? Do they get depressed? Do they lash out? What is that emotional experience of coming up against that conflict? So those are the two characteristics that every hero really has to have. Number one, the person has to be relatable. Again, doesn't have to necessarily be a human being. And number two, the person has to be coming up against conflict, because without conflict, we do not have a story. So I want to talk about some of the different types of stories that we as marketers might want to tell to enhance our content marketing program, and then how to address the question of the hero of that story. So I'm going to go through 3 different types of stories that would fit in very well to any marketer's content marketing program. The first story is the brand story. Where did your company come from? Where did your brand come from? How did it get started? So when you go to tell that story, the hero obviously is going to be the founder or founders of your company. So remember the 2 characteristics, relatable and conflict. So to make those founders relatable, give a little bit of their backstory. Show that they were human beings with flesh and blood, and share some personal details about them to really get the audience engaged and get them on board and saying, "Wow, I really want to root for this Steve Jobs guy. He seems like a go-getter and not necessarily the nicest person on earth, but someone I really want to see succeed." Really get into that backstory and don't just start when the person gets the idea for the company. Really tell a little bit of their history, give a little bit of their background, share some of their flaws maybe that people can really relate to. And they're going to be all the more engaged when you get into the conflict. So the conflict would be the obstacles that the founders faced when they started that company. It cannot have been a walk in the park. No company founding is a walk in the park. If one was, let me know, because I've not heard of one. What obstacles were they up against? Did they have zero money? Were they trying to work their day jobs and start this company at the same time? Were they facing stiff competitions from much, much larger corporations? What are the obstacles that they faced when they created this company? And that's going to give you a really good, really solid foundation to continue with the story, because the reader's going to be engaged, or the listener, however you're telling the story. They're really going to be engaged. Puppies, that's enough. They're really going to be engaged, and they're really going to want to follow those characters all the way through the story and stick with them to the end. So when you're telling your brand story, make sure you create a really, really clear picture of the founder or founders of your company and really share them on a very personal level with your audience. And then make sure you address that conflict very specifically. And again, talk about the emotions behind that conflict. How do they feel? How do they take the news that they're maybe the company that they just left is coming up with a competing product? Or really get into that conflict so that they can so you can deepen the reader's engagement level and really want to make them stick with you and have them asking the question, what's going to happen next? So that's the brand story. That's the first type of story that we as marketers can tell very successfully. The second type of story we can tell, which is akin to the brand story, is the product story. So talking about a product or a service that you created that is uniquely yours, and tell the story of how that product came to be. How did it come to exist? One of my favorite business stories has to do with the co-founder of Nike, a gentleman named Bill Bowerman. So remember that every hero has to be relatable and there has to be conflict. So what is relatable is about Bill Bowerman is that he was not an engineer. He was not, he didn't work for some big company who charged him with the task of creating a better running shoe. He was a coach. He was an athletic coach, and he was an athletic trainer, I believe up in Oregon. And he was dealing with the conflict of the fact that his athletes really needed shoes with better traction. The soles of their shoes were very flat at the time, and they wanted something with traction, but then again, they wanted something that didn't add too much weight, because they needed, of course, to be very aerodynamic. So that's just one example of creating a product story around a hero. So if your product or your service has a good story behind it, the way that the way the idea came about, the way the idea was developed, make sure you make that a very personal story around the people who were involved in creating that product or service, and really go through the thought process, go through the problem they were trying to solve when they were coming up with this product or service. And then the conflicts that came up with the product. Were there a million other comparable products on the market? Was it a product no one had ever heard of? When Steve Jobs introduced the iPod, it was so unique, there was nothing else like it, and he could have faced a real uphill battle. In fact, I'm sure he did in the early days of just trying to get people on board with this totally new gizmo that was so unlike anything they'd ever heard of. So again, make your hero relatable. And also get into the conflict that was around the creation of that product or service. So the product story is the second type of story that we can share. And the third type of story is one of the most popular, and that is the customer story. So if you go to any number of websites, you're going to probably see any number of customer stories or case studies or success stories or whatever they happen to call them. And I really want to spend some time on this type of story because this is where a lot of marketers trip up. They get it wrong. Yes, they do get it wrong. And the reason they get it wrong, let me hit you with this. The reason they get it wrong is they make themselves the hero of the story. And you think, whoa, wait a minute, Parker. This is my case study. This is how I help my customer. How the heck am I not the hero? And the answer is the customer has to be the hero because the customer is going to be the relatable one. You know, you want potential customers to come to your site and start reading this story and start looking at this customer and saying, wow, I really relate to this person. I want to, they're up against conflict. I want to see them succeed. And then if your company just swoops in and takes over the hero role and fixes everything, it's kind of a letdown. Imagine if, to cite a very famous story a lot of us are familiar with, Lord of the Rings. Just imagine if Frodo had come to possess the ring and brought it to Gandalf, and Gandalf said, "Oh, I'll take care of this for you," and flew over to dump the ring in Mount Doom, and end of story. That would have been kind of a letdown because we're invested in Frodo. We want to see him succeed. We want to see him take on this task. And that's what it would be like if you just kind of set up this customer, set up what they were dealing with, and then set yourself up as the hero that swooped in and saved the day. So in telling your customer story, here's how to position yourself. Your company is not the Frodo of the story. Get back to the Lord of the Rings analogy. Your company is not the Frodo. Your company is more of the Gandalf. If you put it in Star Wars terminology, your company is the Yoda. Your company is the wise sage and the guide and the Sherpa that accompanies the hero and helps the hero overcome conflict and accomplish his or her goals. So again, when you go to create these customer stories, make sure that from beginning to end, your customer is the indisputable hero of the story. Resist the temptation to put on the cape yourself and make yourself the hero because you're gonna lose your audience. They can't relate to you as the brand. They can't relate to you. Or they can, but not on the same level that they can relate to your customer. So make sure that you keep your customer the focus of that story. Every decision that they make, everything that they decide to do with you, everything they decide to let you help them with, it's got to be their show. It's got to be their story. So again, when you set up that customer, make sure, number one, that this is relatable, that the person is relatable. You're not just talking about a company, but tell about who you worked with over there. Were you dealing with a VP of marketing who was just watching these impressions numbers go down, and was just looking for a new solution? Were you dealing with a chief operations officer who was dealing with safety issues, and they were dealing with getting dinged on their compliance reports because of safety issues? Who are the people involved? Make sure that you set them up and give them flesh and blood, make them relatable. Maybe your customer couldn't relate to a chief operations officer, but they could certainly relate to someone who is just between a rock and a hard place, to use an American expression, or someone who is just in this impossible situation that they don't see a way out of. Everyone can relate to that. So make sure you set them up, number one, as a flesh and blood human being, and number two, really set up that conflict and really let your reader or let your audience know what was behind that conflict. What was the emotion behind it? How did it make that person feel? What did it make that person worry about? And then from there, that sets up the foundation for a wonderful customer story where you can act as, again, the Gandalf, the Yoda, the wise sage, or the guide that helps the hero through this and overcome this conflict and accomplish his or her goals. So those are just a few examples of the kinds of stories that we as marketers can tell. And we're going to revisit these as we go throughout this month of storytelling here at Resonance. But I wanted to set those up in terms of how you establish the heroes of those stories. Because again, it's all about the hero. You know, if your audience isn't invested in a flesh and blood or a person hero, again, doesn't have to be a flesh and blood human being. It could be a Buzz Lightyear, you know, but the audience has to relate to a person. And so it's so important to set up the heroes when you go to tell these stories. And remember, the hero is the key to an emotional experience, and emotion is the key to connection. And connection is the key to relationship, and relationship is the key to sales. So that's how all that works, you see. Again, I hope all this makes sense. If you have a question or you want to join the conversation, I would love to hear from you. So we will give that contact info at the end of the podcast, and I welcome you to contact me at any time. Now it's time for our content marketing tip of the week. For today's tip, I want to talk about a simple way to really amp up the emotional appeal of your stories and give them a real extra zip, and that is by using dialogue. Have you ever been reading a novel and you find yourself kind of buzzing through the long paragraphs, the descriptions, and really gravitating towards the dialogue? Is there a sense of relief when you come to the dialogue? It's like, okay, this is where it gets good. And that's a very important literary tactic. Dialogue really moves a story along and gives it action and lets it really adds a sense of aliveness to a story, if that makes sense. So when you go to tell your story, really look for opportunities to create some dialogue. So for example, instead of saying, I found out the project was canceled, and then continuing with the story, stop for a minute and pause and really get into that conversation. How did you find out the project was canceled? Who delivered the news? Was it in person? Was it over the phone? How did the conversation go? What were the words that were used in that conversation? And that's really going to deepen your reader's level of engagement when they read that story. And it's really going to help move things along and really give it some new life. So, and I will say you can take a little creative license when you create dialogue around something that happens in your story. It does not necessarily have to be word for word. If it were word for word, it would probably be really boring. So, feel free to edit a little bit as long as you kind of keep the whole spirit of the thing. You can use some creative license to move things along, but do look for opportunities to use dialogue to move your story along. It's going to engage the reader. It's going to make your story more human and much more memorable. Okay, campers, that is it for me today. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. If you like what you've heard today, please feel free to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or via our RSS feed. And if you really like what you've heard, please leave us a quick review on iTunes. I would so appreciate it. And I do so appreciate everyone who has left us a review on iTunes. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. For more information about content marketing, you're welcome to visit our website at resonancecontent.com, pardon the puppy Melee in the background, where you'll also find links to our pages on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and other social networks. If you'd like to submit a question to cover in an upcoming tip of the week, just go to askrachelparker.com, type in your question, and we'll get it answered. As always, I like to leave you with a quote, and today's comes from one of my favorite books on writing. It is by Stephen King and is called simply On Writing. And, before I share the quote, I've referred to this book before. It's really a delightful read. It really is. Part of it is Stephen King just going through his journey as a writer, and then the other part is sharing his advice to writers. And I've never been a real fan of Stephen King because I'm a big old scaredy cat, but he's really engaging. He's very you just want to grab him and go to Starbucks and have coffee and chat. So if you've not read his book on writing, I highly recommend it. Okay, on to the quote. He says, Quote, "In many cases, when a reader puts a story aside because it got boring, the boredom arose because the writer grew enchanted with his powers of description and lost sight of his priority, which is to keep the ball rolling." Unquote. Again, this is Rachel Parker with Resonance Content Marketing. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.